So it's good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Tonight we're gonna listen to our friend Frida Berrigan speak on about her father, 100 years of fighting the Lambs War, the life and legacy of Phil Berrigan. Frida is from New London, Connecticut. She is married with 3 kids. She's a community activist, organizing around affordable home ownership with the land trust, and also against the ever-stretching shadow of militarism in Connecticut. She is the author of many essays and appears often in tomsdispatch.com. She is the author of the 2015 book, It Runs in the Family, on being raised by radicals and growing into rebellious motherhood. Frida came to Fargo back in 2017 and spoke to about 150 people. And some of you may have been there that night. So without further ado, I want to give it over to Frida.
We should mute now, right?
Please mute.
Mute away. Feel free to mute. Good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be with all of you, those whose faces I can see and those whose faces I can't see. What a way to end a day, a cold and wintry Tuesday here in southeastern Connecticut. It was a snow day, which ate into my preparation for this evening a little bit. But I hope you'll be a kind and flexible audience as I work through my materials here. And Dave, if you want to read along, I'm going to be reading from a couple passages of Fighting the Lambs War. So anyway, great to be with all of you, and I hope to speak for not so long, and then I'll open it up for conversation, for questions, and I really thank the Presentation Prayer Center and Scott, my dear friend. I was going to say dear old friend, but people get sensitive these days about age, and I think Scott's significantly younger than I am, so I can't call him my old friend. Without any further ado, I'm happy to be here and going to jump right in. Philip Berrigan was born on October 5th, 1923. He turned 50 a few months before he became a father in 1974. So this October, just a few months from now, would be his 100th birthday. He died, of course, in 2002, only a few months after he turned 79 years old. I'm 48 years old now, although obviously I don't look it, and closer to 50 all the time. I realized recently that I started rounding up and saying, oh, I'm almost 50, just kind of as a matter of course, trying to get used to it. But I often reflect on how my father's life and what he remembers of his early life, those formative years so long ago, how all of that is inside of me. And inside of me, even as I send texts and emojis and doom scroll on Facebook and point and click my way to e-commerce bliss, there is the cells and genes and microbes and charism of someone who walked miles to school and back every day, was beaten by ruthless or under-resourced, depending on your perspective, sisters in his parochial schools, and was born into a hard-scrabble, pre-depression agrarian life, born in northern Minnesota, and then grew up those early years in upstate New York. Of course, if I consider my grandmother, for whom I'm named, Frida Fromhart, née Berrigan, or is it Bergen, nay Fromhard. I think that's the way you're supposed to say it. I can go back into the 1880s, the 1870s, and a small community in Germany's Black Forest, the name of which is lost to time and to the oft-changing wartime borders. That boggles my mind that I'm 2 generations away from that experience. It's almost abstract. It's so far away. But my father, born these 100 years ago, is not abstract. He's still very present in so much of my daily life, even as he's 2 decades passed from this mortal coil. His habits and preferences are my own, I reflect, without any real effort or intentionality on my part. He did these eye exercises. I invite you all to try it. It's very refreshing, where you go kind of like, Can you see what I'm doing? Look up, up, down, down, side, 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 side. It's a really good thing to do. I see some of you doing it. Don't you feel more awake? So I do that. I shift my foot. I shift from foot to foot when I'm vigiling or cooking or standing for too long. I have a tendency to reuse dental floss. I try and include my children in the grossest and most tedious tasks and chores around the house. And I get mad at them when they don't enjoy these experiences with me and my undivided attention, which I'm gifting them as we turn the compost or clean out the chicken coop. I was invited as a child to go under the car to change the oil and clean out the garbage bags that we reused at Jonah House, things like that. In me too is his impulse to reach out, to embrace, to connect. My father taught me to sew. He taught me to replace buttons on shirts and how to mend hems. I learned that from him. He taught me to take care of my fingernails and my teeth and the importance of a good scalp massage. I tend my children's many wounds the way he tended mine, with gruff care and a lot of hydrogen peroxide, which I think is frowned upon in the medical establishment at this point, but still sold in stores. I hear his voice constantly in my ear, in my head, in my heart, words of encouragement in my doubt, and words of exasperation with my luxury seeking, words of appreciation when I use my gifts and my gifts in the service of others, and words of comfort and perspective when I fall into self-pity. So these are some of the ways in which my father is very much alive in my life. And so now I want to shift and sort of intersperse, weave together some of his words with some of my memories to kind of draw a picture or weave a fabric of 100 years of skirmishes with the American Empire. And as David Eberhardt held up, I'll also hold up this Fighting the Lamps War, which was, published by Common Courage Press in 1996, and is the result of, of course, my dad worked on it, but real credit goes to Fred Wilcox, who was at the time a professor at Ithaca College, who really pulled all of this out of my dad. Dad would talk into one of those, kind of brick-shaped, what are they even called? Cassette recorders, with the big buttons, and he would get a sheet of questions from Fred Wilcox, and then he would talk into the machine. And he was always so mad about it. It was not his preferred way of doing things. And then Fred would type it all up. And a couple of times when my father was in prison, he would work on the manuscript back and forth in the mail. So there's a lot of good stuff here. Most of the times I just looked for my own name but it doesn't come until quite late in the book. And so it's not where I'm going to start tonight. So I'll start here. For those of you reading along, I'm on page 8, Dave. Dad writes, I go to school every day, do my homework, do what I'm told. Like most students, I learn by rote, swallowing propaganda, and in examinations, regurgitating nonsense and half-truths. Our textbooks reflect the grandeur and glory of our country's past, thrilling us with stories of our forefathers' conquests over savage peoples, with tales of their heroism in battle, their triumphs over 100 enemies. A world where good, white European males always triumph over evil, anyone else. Our teachers don't talk about the robber barons, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Mellon, Billy Vanderbilt at all. They don't tell us how they lied, cheated, and pillaged, building their empires on the backs of immigrant labor. We don't learn about the stock manipulations and the scam artist money deals that sent the stock market crashing in 1929, destroying the lives of farmers and factory workers, driving millions into poverty, hunger, and early death. We are never told that 50 to 100 million Africans perished in the holds of slave ships, or that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and other American heroes owned slaves. No one tells us how our Native American brothers and sisters were massacred, starved, and poisoned into submission. We aren't told why our country went to war in 1917, or why we have been fighting someone, somewhere, for something, ever since the War of Independence. I cannot blame the priests and nuns because they're passing down what they have learned, what they believe to be true, what they think everyone has always known. Only after I come home from the war will I learn we were firing on Japanese shipping before the attacks on Pearl Harbor, and that the American tycoons were worried about the expanding Japanese empire, which was threatening our hegemony in the Pacific. It was inevitable that we would go to war against Japan. Just one more paragraph here. Only much later, after I had killed other human beings, will I find out that World War II was not about saving Jews from Nazi extermination, any more than the Civil War was about liberating slaves. Hitler invaded Austria, stomped through Czechoslovakia, slaughtered his way across Poland. We watched. His brown shirts killed Jews, socialists, homosexuals, and communists. We stood by. I knew none of this when I was drafted in 1943. I just accepted that the insidious Japanese and Germans have stabbed Uncle Sam in the back and needed to be defeated, even destroyed. Our dad would tell us, myself and my younger brother and sister, Jerry, who's a year younger than I am, and our sister Kate, who's 7 years younger than I am. He would tell us, he would always tell us that that he didn't wake up. He didn't wake up until he was in his 40s. He'd tell us that he sleptwalked through his early years. You three, he'd say to us, you three were born awake. You know so much more at 6 or 12 or 15 than I knew when I was 35. And I'd listen to that with my mouth open. Me? No more than him? Impossible, impossible. And he'd say it with love and admiration. And sometimes he would say it with exasperation, like, you guys know more than me and you're still farting around, you know. But, you know, upon reflection and hearing those words again tonight, he was right. We did know more than he knew as a young person, because he and our mom taught us. They taught us about racism. We, as kids, went to almost all Black schools and got a first-class social education, having the sadly rare glimpse into what it feels like to be a minority as a person by being that that minority. Black friends, Black teachers, Black principals, Black police, Black guidance counselors, Black mentors. We learned to navigate a world that didn't really know what to make of my brother and sister and I. We knew about slavery and about segregation and about Jim Crow and about white supremacy, and learned about all of those things in almost all Black contexts. I wasn't in the majority in any kind of real way until I went off to college. We learned about war, right? We watched documentaries about Japan on our 16-millimeter projector on the wall of our living room. We knew that bombs didn't save lives, didn't end wars. We met Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They taught us paper cranes, taught us the importance of telling stories and bearing witness, and the power of personalizing the war experience, how important it is to put one human face on the slaughter of tens of thousands of people in a second. We learned about the waste endemic in Americanism by dumpster diving and wearing secondhand clothes and basically living very austere, kind of lay monastic lives, even as 10-year-olds, which was more fun in retrospect than as it all played out. But we were born awake, right? We read Howard Zinn and Mother Jones as small kids, and were insufferable as a result. And it was a gift. And it was a gift that he and our mom gave us, even as it felt sort of tedious a lot of the time. So, my father was this sort of youngest of six, hardscrabble, parochially educated kid. And that's one dimension to his life. Another dimension to his life was his experience as a soldier. He spent 15 months in the European theater during World War II and described himself out of that experience as a skilled killer. He writes, "I was a skilled killer, trained in the use of all small arms, clever with the bayonet, good with a submachine gun and the Browning automatic rifle. This is exactly what I was, a highly skilled young killer." He writes in Fighting the Lambs War of the war ending in Europe in May of 1945, and being trained for the Japanese invasion as an officer, and somebody with the skills that he had developed or had been developed in him. He fully expected to be part of an invasion from the sea of Japan. But of course, then August 6, 1945 happened, and he went home instead. He writes, returning from Europe on a troop ship, I won $400 or $500 in a poker game. So I had plenty of money in my pockets when I got home. I met old friends, told a few war stories, started dating. It seemed to me that I had been spared because my war experiences could have been much worse. I didn't lose any limbs. I didn't feel particularly traumatized, even though I had seen some pretty ugly things. A concentration camp with its crematoria still intact, the stench of death permeating the ground, air, and buildings, bombed out cities piled high with decaying bodies, headless torsos floating in formaldehyde. I helped free the world from Hitler's reign of terror. I served my country in wartime because I thought that's what patriots do. God may tell us not to kill, but when the state calls, we must obey. We must become skilled, remorseless killers, willing to use any means to defeat the enemy. And he goes on, Daniel Daniel Berrigan, his older brother, was at Jesuit Seminary in Woodstock, Maryland, outside Baltimore, and I've wanted very much to see him. In another era, I might have ridden a great white horse, decorated with my coat of arms, into the swarm of merry revelers. But it was 1945, and I couldn't as much as catch a cab. I put on my uniform and started hitchhiking my way to Maryland. The welcome was warm, very enthusiastic. We sang, toasting the war's end, patting ourselves on the back. There were many men in uniform, but I was the only officer. So I carried the flag as we marched around the main building. A couple of platoons of soldiers, 200 Jesuits, friends, family, kids, all cheering our country's victory, congratulating ourselves. Philip the Bold headed the procession, warm shivers of patriotism rushing up and down my spine. I'd done the right thing. Harry Truman had done the right thing. The crew of the Enola Gay had done the right thing. We marched that day for God and country, cheerful victors celebrating the end of the war and the use of the most barbaric weapon the world has ever seen. Years later, I learned that 8,000 or 9,000 Americans refused to serve in the war, but I knew nothing about these people then. I think now that this was part of the government's genius. No one knew about these resistors. They were stowed away in detention camps or federal prison, and the whole affair that anyone would dare to oppose killing was kept secret. The American people must not be allowed to know about patriots like David Dellinger, Robert Lowell, and Eamon Hennessy. We must never know that in a warrior society, it takes real courage to refuse to kill. Robert Lowell, Eamon Hennessy, David Dellinger, Dad made sure that we knew these stories. He didn't become a father until almost 30 years after the war, and he didn't tell war stories. Like, this was not anything that he talked about. In fact, it's only now that I'm sort of putting together, he talked about Woodstock, the Jesuit seminary in outside of Baltimore, and we would go as kids to Woodstock, which was no longer a seminary. It was just kind of woods, and there was a quarry there where we would swim. And it's not really until now that I realized that Dan being there as a seminarian was how we knew about the existence of this great swimming hole, and that's where my father had gone right after the war. To hear his account of fighting, killing, seeing death, I needed to read his words, right? Those were not a part of our family conversations. What he did tell us was peace stories. The stories of those who suffered in CO camps and brigs and alternative service instead of going off to war, as he did. And his admiration for those men was through the roof. He made sure that we understood that the real heroes of war are those who don't fight. And he didn't know the story of Ben Salmon until long after this book was written, right? Ben Salmon, the self-taught Catholic theologian who could not get conscientious objector status because of the Catholic Church's just war theory. Oh, he's a conscientious objector to World War I, right? And he's the one who said, either Jesus was a liar or war is never necessary. And Dad would say that to us all the time. Either Jesus or Christ was a liar or war is never necessary. Funny, just like a little note about Robert Lowell, a poet and conscientious objector to World War II, served time at Danbury decades and decades before Phil Berrigan was also there. And in his letter, rejecting his draft notice, I just think this is hilarious. He wrote, "Dear Mr. President, I very much regret that I must refuse the opportunity you offered me in your communication of August 6, 1943. And Lowell went off to Danbury, serving about a year there. And moving on here into some other things. Right, of course, after my father was a soldier, he became a priest. He became a Josephite priest. And he writes a lot about that experience in fighting the Lamb's War. He writes, I became a priest, someone my parishioners could depend on and trust, a representative of the Roman Catholic Church. But what really did I know? I had spent 15 months in Europe participating in the horrors of modern warfare and knew nothing about war. I determined to help men and women live together in holy matrimony, and I knew nothing about marriage. I wanted to help people be good citizens, even though I didn't know how our government functions. I had committed my life to helping others, yet I didn't have the slightest idea why millions of Americans live in poverty. I was going to be a friend to working men and women without understanding the labor movement's struggle for safe working conditions and fair pay. He continues, the church is a major bureaucracy, and major bureaucracies are disobedient to the gospel. If the church wants to come to grips with the gospel, it would give up its property and its exemptions from the state, involve itself with resistance on a major scale. It would have to resist the violence against our poor and stop pretending that one political party is more humane than the other. But even with this critique, he writes, I've never had the slightest temptation to leave the Catholic Church, and I'm extremely grateful for everything the church has done for me. After I was excommunicated in 1973, several other Christian bodies asked me to join them and to minister under their aegis. I refused because I have never considered myself anything but a Roman Catholic trying to become Christian. My roots are in the church, and in spite of all the prostitutions and betrayals of the institutional church, these roots are life-giving. The church, these deep roots, he passed those on to us, on to me. We were friends with nuns and priests. We lived with them. We studied the scriptures with them. We watched them get arrested and eventually got arrested by their sides. My brother and sister and I learned the Bible studies, and our dad taught us to put ourselves into those stories, ask the text, to get caught up in the drama, like reading a play. The Bible was everywhere. It was in the glove box of the car to be pulled out and read at the beginning of every car trip. It was at my parents' bedside table, worn thin and studded with bookmarks. It was on bookshelves all over the house. Favorite translations, new interpretations, the Gospels of Sola Taname, the Cotton Patch Bible of Clarence Jordan. We had house church and house Bible study, and all of our interactions with the institutional church, most of them that weren't kind of Catholic worker weddings, were with our mom's family in Montclair, New Jersey. These funerals and weddings were stiff, awkward affairs where mom and dad listened too closely to the homily, sang with too much enthusiasm, and were constantly surprised and irritated that we didn't know when to stand or how to take communion. My dad would go on to live as a priest, confronting racism within the church and within our society. And then, as you all, I think, know, taking a bold stance against the war in Vietnam with the Baltimore 4. What's up, Baltimore 4, Dave Eberhardt? Draft card burning, and then the Catonsville 9 action in May of 1968. And he went to jail. He went to jail and continued to organize within prisons and jails, forming study circles and Bible study groups within the prison, resisting human rights violations and injustices within prisons and jails. And those experiences were formative. And I'll just read a little bit from here. So in Danbury, Dad writes, John Bach and myself and other members of our resistance group had often discussed nonviolence. Outside the walls, the peace movement was going through a painful struggle. Martin Luther King was dead. American cities were war zones. Activists were frustrated and angry. President Nixon ridiculed dissent, expanded the killing fields, encouraged his supporters to attack peaceful demonstrators. Disillusioned and bitter, the Weathermen and others were calling for violent revolution. Nonviolence, they said, had failed. Fire must be fought with fire, violence with violence. But nonviolence was not defunct. We just needed to envision new ways to work, not as individual peace activists, but as extended families, working and living together, sharing our love, our talents, everything we had, supporting one another for the long haul. That is, for the rest of our mortal lives. So, and then he talks about that the work of forming the Jonah House community with Liz McAllister, my mom, and John Bach, and others. And writes, resistors cannot persist and survive without community. Sooner or later, they will be frustrated and crushed. That's why we invested so much time, effort, and money into starting Jonah House. We wanted a place where people could share meals and ideas, study scripture together, and support one another for the long haul. When friends went to prison, we would care for their children. When they left jail, we would welcome them home. If someone was upset or depressed, we would listen to their problems, give them a hug, let them know that we love them. We tried to be a loving family, committed to the spirit and reality of nonviolent resistance. This, I think, was one of the failures of the anti-war movement. Activists didn't spend enough time building community. When we did form support groups and communities within prison, the results were extraordinary. We felt collective hope. Our spirits lifted. And Dad goes on, and you're writing really self-critically about, his, how hard he was on people, how hard he was on himself in the context of community. And ends up kind of with this funny part here. After 23 years of living in community, mind you, this was 1996, I'm a good deal mellower. It's all relative, I suppose. I've discovered something about forgiveness, mercy, and tolerance. Not as much, perhaps, as I should have learned, but more than I knew before. I can accept the deficiencies of other people just as I can live with my own deficiencies, which, believe me, are legion. And there's a candor to about how difficult life in community is throughout fighting the Lamb's War, which is just born of a lot of self-critical reflection. That's perhaps particularly impressive in someone of my father's generation. Upbringing, anyway, so general housing coordinator that we were born into, the painful goodbyes as people went off to jails and prisons, or left angry and hurt, disappointed. But I think that very fact that people kept coming to join my parents in this radical experiment of lay monasticism, poverty, prayer, and resistance was really validating. In fact, many of them left nice houses and wealthy families to dumpster dive and paint houses and get up early to go to protests at the Pentagon. They were, as I kind of understood even as a teenager, they were sort of like a kind of refugee from mainstream America. And it was a little confusing because on the one hand, I coveted much of what they were running away from, right? They had matching furniture probably and matching dishes, and, sat down to a table of 5 instead of 15 for dinner every night. Had probably had brand name peanut butter, all that kind of stuff. But the fact that they were running away from like all that prettiness made me question the dominant narrative. Why would they give all that up? And what were they coming to find in our happy squalor there at 1933 Park Avenue? So, kind of upon reflection, I find myself deeply grateful for that friction that was there. Community, of course, kept me alive and kept me safe while my parents were in jail many times. But perhaps more importantly, community kept me from becoming sort of an American trope of teenage rebellion against one's parents, right? I didn't rebel against my parents in part because community kept me curious, kept me listening and learning, kept me asking why. So we come towards the close. If any of you are falling asleep or nodding off, I swear I'm almost done. And I'm right on schedule, actually, Scott, don't you think? So we come back to this 100 years, right? 100 years since the birth of Philip Berrigan on October 5th, 1923. And I find myself thinking that I'm glad that my father is not alive to witness the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to nuclear midnight. When he died in 2002, the clock, which I think of as the great metronome of my teenage social life, was at 7 minutes to nuclear midnight. At that point, almost relaxed. Go to the movies, kind of a time frame in Phil Berrigan's mind. He was always yelling at me about going to the movies when it was 3 minutes to nuclear midnight. And I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the reflexive nationalism, the glorification of violence that comes along with that war, especially for those of us in the United States so far from the stench of that. I'm glad he's not alive to witness that. I think he'd be heartened by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, by Archbishop Wester using his platform there in New Mexico to call for nuclear abolition. I think he'd be delighted there are still people going to jail for nuclear disarmament. I think he would have been happy that his widow celebrated her 79th birthday in jail for the Kings Bay Plowshares back in 2018. And that, as difficult as I found that, I think that would have made his head explode with pride for his life partner and her deep commitment to this work. I think if he were in this circle today, he'd have a hard time understanding what all these little boxes were. But once he got over that he would ask us all why we're not doing more. Amplify, dramatize, and draw attention. And scrolling in our Wordle streaks. I'm not doing so well, by the way. He'd call us away from all of that and call us to Bible study and to simplifying our lives and to community and to resistance. And 20 years past, he calls me to that every day. And then it's on me to listen or to turn away. I want to close by offering a poem that was written by Uncle Dan, and then I'm eager to hear your thoughts and questions. Discussion. Dan writes a poem called Miracles. Were I God Almighty, I would ordain rain fall lightly where old men trod. No death in childbirth, neither infant nor mother. Ditches firm fenced against the errant blind. Aircraft come to ground like any feather. No mischance, malice, knives, tears dried. Would resolve all flaws and blockage of the mind that makes us mad and sets lives awry. So I pray under the sign of the world's murder, the ruined sun, why are you silent? Feverish as lions, hear us in the world caged, devoid of hope. Still, some redress and healing. The hand of an old woman turns gospel page. It flares up gently, the sudden tears of Christ.
Thank you, Frida. Thank you very much for all of that. We can go into questions and comments, and I know there's the little raise hand emoji that can be used, and if you just want to raise your hand and unmute yourself, and I'll try to, I can't see everyone at once, so I'll try to call on you though. And if I'm not calling on you, just start talking, and we'll try to be kind to each other with this. Well, let me start off. I was wondering, Frida, about what Phil's and Liz's too contemplative practices were like. I remember talking to him one time about I can't remember exactly what it was, but he said he was saying that when they painted, you know, when on the work crew painting, that they would contemplate the Lord's Prayer. And I remember saying something like, "You got to be kidding me." I had no clue as to what I had no clue, you know, no idea what that meant or how you would even do that. But if you could talk a little bit about that, their contemplative practices.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. I can. So my dad had a very demonstrative and I would say rigorous contemplative practice, and he would pray on his knees on the edge of with his elbows on the side of his bed in the morning and in the evening. And the paint crew, as you mentioned, you know, the Jonah House folks, we painted houses to make a living. And people were always like, let's listen to the radio. Let's listen to the radio. And he'd be like, turn that garbage off. Like, we're praying here. We're praying, you know. And I think he certainly prayed. And I don't know if anybody else, Peter DeMott probably had the discipline. Some other folks probably had the discipline to pray as they painted, or to engage in a serious conversation with the person that was closest to you. But then he would also read the Bible every night to himself and take notes and kind of go through a number of texts. They were always reading. We're always reading the great Latin American theologians, Leonardo Boff and Gutierrez and others. So there was just like a daily discipline. I think my mom got called into the life of the community more, and the kind of just the hubbub of our lives too, and had less carved out time that was for prayer. Then my father like really kind of defended that time perhaps better than she did. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Nope, I'm praying here. I can't talk to you right now. But I think both of them would describe it as a well that never runs dry and that always was there for them. In some ways they got to lean on their training, right, as nun and priest. My dad was a priest for 25 years. My mom was a nun for, I think, 14 years. And so, like that was quite an example, but also like a very, that's a long yardstick to measure, to like, without that kind of background, like, where do you start with that? But it really was the wellspring. And I'll just say, because I've mentioned my mom a couple times, and I think some of you in this circle certainly know that she's living with dementia. She's 83. She'll be 83 later this year. As lots of other things fade, the names of people and specifics of her life, both recent past and her earlier life, most of those memories are gone. But her biblical fluency, her ability to engage in prayer, her thirst for those familiar words, they're a place where we're still really able to like connect and communicate. And so I think that's indicative of the strength of that. Like that for her, it's almost, because it's not here anymore, as her mind changes, it's really like, it's very much like in her body in this way that I'm really grateful for, because it's a way that we can continue to connect. So anyway.
Thanks. Suzanne or Shanley? You're on mute. Well.
And David has his hand up.
Okay. We'll take.
You want me to go or you want to go, Susan? I can go.
All right, good, sure.
Couple of artifacts. More recent from the Kings Bay Plowshares, a photo. Children want a nuclear-free world. Going back to 1967. Phil and Tom Lewis, I'm off to the side pouring blood at the customs house. And I just wanted to thank, to say hi to Carmen and Willa. Is that a painting of yours? Ellen, people I know a little bit better. But Frida, oh, and I invite you to send me an email. Let me send you my review of the Berrigan letters and Frida's book, which I think bring out in greater depth behind the scenes types things, which always, as a poet, interests me. I like to ask Frida. She could shed light, and I'm fascinated with what makes a person who keeps standing up. Dan has a great poem. Some stood up, some for a day, some for an hour, and some kept on going. But Phil has a kind of iron military keep on going thing, and how to clone that. I mean, we all have to resist according to our talents. And mine comes more from the secular and artistic. Hymns, although I grew up in the church, and I really do credit religion, but Phil was not that reflective in a poetic way. Dan more, but if you asked him, well, what makes you keep on ticking? He would say community, I'm sure. The Catholic worker people are surrounded by that, and that never appealed too much to me. Hell is other people, in my view, but I'm a cynic. And I wonder, Frida, what you well, it's inheritance, I guess, but can you offer any other magical potions that we could spread on some of our Dummkopf American brothers and sisters? I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
Very lucid presentation, Frida, and it
Oh, thank-
really covers the bases. You're skilled at that. You ought to have a representative, an artist type rep, and go to colleges. I know you do, but they ought to put you forward more, and you would make more money too.
That's the thing, Dave. Okay. I need an agent.
Agent.
No, okay. So thanks for that. And I think, one thing as I sort of reflect on this 100 years and skirmishes with the American Empire, and I think what Dad strove for was humility, and it was not easy for him to move to a place of humility, given his whiteness and his privilege and his big handsome maleness, and the authority that he had as an officer, and then as a collared cleric, that he was, I think, in many ways seeking to shed that kind of soldier warrior mantle, and I think he worked really hard at it. And I think it was one of the reasons that the prison witness became so important to him, because it was one of the few places where he was learning a kind of humility, and really sought out people like Gandhi for that. And I think that while those skills and gifts, Dave, that you were talking about, this kind of the soldier and the big guy, I think in Devout and Dangerous, Jim Forrest described him as kind of a general of the peace movement. And he really, that was uncomfortable for him, and it was not where he really wanted to be, right? And I think he was seeking to move towards gentleness and humility, and in community, even with all kind of warts and all, and struggles and all, frictions and all. That's what he was really putting himself in with people, submitting to consensus, and kind of creating that space, you know, and my mom, I think, really helped him with that. And having kids is, you know, as the parents in the group know, that is a source of humility as well. And we did teach him a couple things. We did. And so anyway, those are just some, you know, kind of thoughts I offer there. And I think he certainly wouldn't want himself cloned. And I think that's not quite, you know, what this moment, you know, requires is not, you know, a peace army of Phil Berrigans, right? But anyway, those are some kind of off the cuff thoughts that your contributions raised, Dave. Thanks.
Yeah, Brayton.
Well, very, very good, Frida. You're a great keeper of the story. All you have to do is tell the story for it to work, you know, and add the great humor that you do. So it's beautiful, beautiful job. So I hear the story, and I think of people of children of famous people. You know, who are they if they have the same name? And I think of, in your case, you have this, you know, moral example, this ferociously convicted, faith-filled, high energy, prophet type father and mother, and mother's in there too with the great influence, and you're able to love that. You don't turn away from it. You don't rebel against it. You know, you seem to embrace it like you did in your book. I thought that was brilliant, that you could love them and still talk about how hard it was. You could admire them. You could walk in their shoes as an adult and still discover who Frida is called to be. So there's got to be a struggle there to find out who you are. And you do seem different from your parents, but wonderful and courageously cognizant of your own destiny and your own path. And so how'd you do that?
Well, Brayton, you know, me and my therapist, you know, this is what we talk about. So, yeah, thank you. That's all I got for that one.
And you had a dream. Wasn't it a dream that your father came to you and allowed you to, and gave you freedom or something? Wasn't it? You told me that.
Oh, Brayton. So I had this dream, and Matt Deloisio, who I gather is on here, would appreciate this. We were fasting in Washington, D.C. With Witness Against Torture, and engaged in this kind of big coming together, or hundreds of people. And I was, you know, carrying, you know, to shut down Guantanamo, and I'm carrying all this stuff, and I'm rushing from the White House to the Supreme Court. I'm trying to get there before everybody to set this stuff up. And I've got all these props, and this is not the dream. This is the real life part. And then I think because I'm fasting and I've been sleeping on the floor of St. Stephen's Church, and I have this sort of waking dream. And in my waking dream, my father, you know, sidles up alongside me and says, "Frida, what are you doing?" And I said, "Whoa, Dad, I'm late to this. You know, everybody's going to be at the Supreme Court, and I got all the signs, and I got all the, you know, maybe I didn't have the sound system, but I had all this stuff, and I'm like, I'm running late, Dad, and I gotta get all this stuff." And he says, "Well, like, nobody's going to just like throw blood on the, you know, on the Supreme Court, you know, like, why do you have all these accessories? Like, this seems so complicated." And I said, "Well, Dad, like, it's complicated so that everybody has like an important role to play. like we're all doing this together. And so we need all these props and all these, things so that each one of us has a part to play. And, we can't all, we can't all throw blood on the pillars of the Pentagon. And then doesn't it just feel icky that, one person does that or three people do that and the rest of us are just sort of spectators, like wishing that we were tough enough to do that. That's not, I don't know, that's not what we're trying to do here. And he was like, oh, well, okay. And then he said, well, that sounds good. I like that part about participation. And I like that part about everybody having a role to play. And then he says, well, go on, get to it. Don't let me hold you up anymore. And I said, okay, thanks, Dad. And he says, you should get some sleep. He says, which is what he was always worried about. You should get some sleep. Are you doing okay? And I was like, well, I'm at the end of my fast, and no, I'm not. I'll be okay. And he's like, okay, well, carry on. And so it was, he had been dead a number of years. I was probably maybe 2009 or 2008 or something like that. So it was not, perhaps it was a visitation, right? Perhaps it was just a, kind of a, who knows what it was, but it felt significant, and it felt like a way that I was taking all that I had learned and all I had been exposed to, and not following a recipe that had been handed to me by somebody else, but was making my own soup, but using the chef techniques that I had been given, if that metaphor, which just came to me, sort of works. Now you can all send me the bill, and I'll give my therapist the week off. So that was very, very nice. Next question.
Eric.
Thanks. Thanks for sharing all this, Frida. I'm just curious. I mean, I know a lot of people on here knew Phil, met Phil. He passed before I was even out of school. I'm just curious. I never really got to experience being around him. I'm just curious, what did you, this is a very vague question, feel free to go any direction you want with it, but what did you learn about love, either socially or interpersonally from him, that you can kind of pass on to those of us who never met him?
Oh, thanks, Eric, for that question. I would say, what would I say? Well, one, I would, and just to say that, in the book that you and Dan did, Eric, you really captured one way in which Phil expressed his love to people, which was in letter writing. And, Dan, his older brother, might have been the person that he wrote to most regularly and most with, kind of almost a constant communication, but he wrote to many of us all the time. And one of the gifts of our separation by prison was our family's ability to write letters back and forth. And while my father was, there was a gruffness and an impatience about him many times. In letters, he was very tender, very complimentary, and took very seriously. I remember writing from college and being all like, "Oh my God, Dad," and he would really respond to everything that I was, kind of point by point, pen pal style, respond to my life. And I think knew way more about like who I was and you know how I was forming than you know than fathers who were in daily proximity to their offspring but weren't kind of inviting this sort of deep back and forth that we were able to do in letters. And he was affectionate, right? Like a big physical guy who liked hugs and kisses and roughhousing. We roughhoused a lot when we were littler and he was younger, and we would play these big ridiculous games, and he would pick us up and even though he was like in his like 50s, mid 50s by the time we were like roughhouse age, and then like in that intimacy of prayer, there was just so much love that was conveyed, and kind of this love of humanity, and then love of like specific individual people, and he again, I think he was like bucking the typecasting that the media and the kind of the Berrigan brother kind of thing in figuring out ways to really express that love. And there was this just kind of earthiness too, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say in response to your question, just like an earthy, humble kind of appreciation of life, and of beauty, and of people coming together. When my brother got married, Jerry got married in June of 2002, so really just a couple months before he died. My dad, maybe some of you were at this wedding, I don't know, but my dad was like a one-man receiving line for hours, like after the wedding. Like the rest of us were like, we're hungry, we're like gonna go get a drink, and he just kept at it, and he personally greeted and hugged every single person at that wedding, and there were like 300 people there. And it really was, after he died, I looked at my brother and I was just like, oh my God, thank you so much for getting married this summer. Like, thank you so much for having this extremely fun, like wonderful celebration of love, because like, yeah, he was the first, and he had, so, and I guess the other story, Eric, I'll share real briefly is when we would go to Syracuse to be with Dad's older brother, Jerry, and Carol, his wife, and my cousins, Carla and Phil and Jay and Maria, we would worship with Jerry at St. Lucy's Parish in Syracuse. And we went there one time, and there had been this terrific storm, and the bell tower had fallen down, and the roof was torn off the church. And so we were worshiping in the hall across the street, and it was really crowded, and this, like, the acoustics were bad, and linoleum floor, and very cold. St. Lucy's worships with the L'Arche community. So there's a large number of deaf people who are part of the congregation. And so everybody's signing, and the way they do the Lord's Prayer is they sing it, and they use just this like totally ecstatic singing of the Lord's Prayer. And we're holding hands, we're all squished together, and we're singing the Lord's Prayer. And I look over at my dad, and he's sobbing, right? Like, he's singing and he's just sobbing. And I like barely seen him cry, like, in our entire lives together. And I go in and I kind of like hug him, and he's just like, this is what church is like, this is church, like, this is what church needs to be like. Oh, this is so beautiful. And he was right. Like, it was like, oh, like, this is how, like, this is the beloved community. This is like the people. And it was just like, yeah, like, this is what love is. And he was, allowing himself to be just completely taken up into the spirit of that moment. So, thanks for that question.
Thanks, Frida. Ted?
Hear me?
Yep.
Okay, Frida, I just was wondering if you could speak for a moment about the relationship between your father and your Uncle Dan in your dad's last remaining years, how much they saw each other, how they stayed in contact, and what that relationship was like toward the end.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ted. Good to be with you. So, my Uncle Dan was, 2 years older than Phil, actually more like a year and a half, right? Dan's birthday is May 5th, 1921. And no, anyway, you can do the math. And they remained very, very close all the way through. And as we got more into emails and typing and all that kind of stuff, Dan and Phil would continue to just write each other notes back and forth, and to see each other as much as possible. In my father's last year, right, he got out of prison in December of 2001, and then was diagnosed with cancer in I think September or October of 2002, and then refused any treatment and went into hospice, and died, as I said, at the beginning of December. But before his health problems manifest so dramatically, he was really gripped by this idea of a national strike, and that the way to end war making was for Americans to engage in a national work strike. And I joked with him that in order to strike, one would need to have a job. And so, because he didn't have a job. Okay, maybe it's oh, you guys are all muted, or you'd be like, yeah, laughing as hard as I am on that one. But so Dan really liked this idea and supported it. Another unemployed senior citizen for the national strike. So, and maybe not to just get into stories, but my father's love for his brother was so strong and so pure that that around Thanksgiving, Dad asked Dan to come and perform last rites for him. Please come perform last rites. So Dan came, and the night after celebrating Art Laffin and Colleen McCarthy's wedding, members of the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Community in Washington, D.C., Dan comes home and performs last rites on his younger brother. And then later that night, my father calls for my mom. He wakes up in the middle of the night and he calls for Liz, and he says, "Liz, Dan performed the last rites. And so what's up? Like, I'm still here." And she says, "Well, Phil, like, doesn't work that way. Like, you're still quite physically strong. And the hospice nurse thinks that, you probably have another, you have another couple weeks, 10 days, and he says, "No, but Dan did the last rites." And so that was my father's, belief in my uncle's, power and connection to the Great Spirit that gives life and takes it when particularly when people are ready, as my father really very much was, ready to for the next phase of being, right? Ready for death. So that passing was really hard on my uncle, because it was his younger brother, and really his, and they were shoulder to shoulder in so many things for so long. And Dan missed him and mourned him in a way that I had the great privilege of sort of a front row seat to, as I continued to walk with my uncle until his death in 2016. So Dan mourned the death of Thomas Merton, and perhaps a handful of other people. His mother passing, my grandmother in 1976, and he carried those sorrows with him, and they were very evident. They were right on the surface, even years and decades later. The death of David Darst was another one, his fellow member of the Catonsville Nine, and perhaps the death of the young man who immolated himself at the United Nations, whose name I'm forgetting right at this moment. But my father's death, was very, very sad for my uncle. So anyway, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but that's what your question elicited. So
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Frida, back when Reba and I were engaged and lived at the Catholic Worker in DC, we did I guess what you call pre-marriage counseling with Liz, and also with Phil via those letters you were talking about. And that was very wonderful experience. But I was wondering what their marriage has taught you about married life, being parents.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Scott. Man, I would have loved to have been a fly on that wall with you and Reba and my mom and my dad through those letters. And I hope you still have them. You can give them to your kids when they get married, if they get married. So Brad Wolf is on the Zoom here, and Brad is working on an edited volume of Phil's writing that's going to be published by Fordham University Press, hopefully later this year, and he's calling it Ministry of Risk. And so I just want to applaud Brad. And Brad sent me a letter, or not a letter, like basically an ode to Liz. Oh yeah, Carmen, thank you. Roger Laporte. Roger Laporte is a grief my uncle carried, very much so. But anyway, so Brad, I hope that the ode to Liz gets in the book, and my mom and dad really loved each other, and the kind of the romance of their getting together, and the clandestine love affair, and the airing of their letters, and federal court in Harrisburg, and all of that. They never talked about that any more than my father talked about his time in Europe in the war, and so there's this kind of great romance that I very much learned about by reading Prince of Peace by James Carroll, which is kind of terrible novelization of the story, and but they I guess to go back to your question, I think they taught me that like it's work, like that marriage is work, and that it's like and then it's like this daily checking in and taking time and being on the same page and appreciating each other's differences. And those are the pieces that I really like pull out. That it's better to have different strengths. And my dad will say that he pretty much left the raising of us to our mom, but I think that's really given himself a short shrift, because he really was, when he was not in jail, was quite hands-on with all of us. But I have this image. I was a big eavesdropper when I was a kid, and I was always listening in on things, and they would probably spend like an hour every night sort of talking about their day and talking about what the next day would bring, and kind of the like information back and forth, kind of the business of the community. But there was also just this this kind of everything that happens upstairs, right? We lived in the basement. Everything that happens upstairs is sort of like this public life of the community, and then downstairs we kind of cocoon up and recharge for the next day. And without being sort of precious or twee about that, they really did take time for one another. And I think that was a real balm, BALM, to them. And I guess the other thing that I'll say is that, oh shoot, I had it and then I lost it. They vocally appreciated one another, just back and forth and in public. And I think that as I've been in relationships and all of that, that is not just something that everybody does, and that is a skill that they really honed, and it is something that really helps a marriage along. I appreciate you in this specific way, in this specific moment, for this specific thing that you did. It's just like, boom, like it's like love potion number 9 right there.
Well, that's wonderful, Frida. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for all those stories. I think that's a good place to end. Yeah. Thanks for being back with us. I really, really do appreciate it. And thank you all for being part of this night. For you local people, we have a couple of things on the schedule yet. A retreat on March 11th, on Saturday, March 11th, and a class, Embracing Interfaith Dialogue, which is happening starting next Wednesday for 5 weeks. So if you're interested in those things, please contact me. So I'll say good night and God bless you all, and I'll see you another time. Thank you.